In my day job, I can barely get through a week or two without somebody asking legal questions. Things like, what do I do when a client doesn't want to take my advice or deploy the security thing? Or how do I structure my contracts? How do I make that work? And how do I change my MSA? And those kinds of questions, right? Those are some pretty common questions. Client-facing legal questions are really important to think about when it comes to running your business. So that's what we're going to talk about today. My name is Adam Hanneman. Welcome to Ramblings of a Geek. I've spent the last 25 years or so in the MSP space and have been working to level up my business acumen. And really, the legal side of the world is one of those more important pieces. In fact, had I not gotten into computers when I was young, I may have landed in law school at some point. I'm not sure I had the stomach for law school, but we'll just leave that alone for now. But the idea here is that I think it's important that we talk about some client-related questions and kind of solve some of those problems. Now, here's the thing. I'm not a lawyer, nor have I ever played one on TV. So it's important that you do have a law firm or a lawyer that you talk to on a regular basis. If you're looking for a legal service, I will drop the names and URLs for a few folks that I directly recommend in the description of this video, because there are some people I absolutely recommend in the space. So today we're going to be covering the top 4 questions about how to handle some legal stuff as it relates to your client contracts. So the first question that usually comes up is, how do I structure my contracts? Do I have this long thing? Do I have a bunch of individual contracts? Like, what does that look like? How do I structure the whole piece? Now, I've mentioned it before in a video, which I'll link above, I talk about your client contracts as a stack of sorts. You want to have a standardized set of agreements that you use with all of your clients, right? You wouldn't want to have a client that has basically custom infrastructure, per client, because that's really hard to handle. Well, you shouldn't have this big monolithic, hard to manage, hard to deploy, hard to support agreement in place for all the legal side of the world, because as you know, with clients who are very much not stack compliant, anything kind of goes when you have to troubleshoot a messy network. Well, anything might happen when you have to troubleshoot a messy contract as well. So let's talk about building that stack in an efficient and repeatable manner, right? So I think your stack starts at the very top with your MSA. Now, your MSA is that foundational governance document about how you're going to interact with your client, right? This is the business relationship defined document. It talks about your limitations of liability and non-solicitation of employees and force majeure and payment terms and all this, all of the stuff that has to live in that spot. That is where all that stuff lives, because this governs everything else that you do with your client. That second layer is all about the services you provide. The services being your managed services stuff, your VoIP stuff, your security things, all the projects you do, right? If you define a service, it lives in this second set of documents. And these second set of documents, by the way, also include the length of contract, right? So if your managed services offering is a 1 year or 3 year type of an agreement, that's where that would live as well, right? The idea is that the second set of documents defines the services. And then you have that third layer, which is the kind of proposal quote, where the pricing kind of lives, right? When you have that pricing living separate from your services document, again, you're trying to make this stuff modular, and this is one of the things that makes it more modular. It also prevents the idea that when you go to present to a prospect, that they flip to that back page and they look for the pricing, because you can actually hold that a little bit separately just while you're having those conversations. Because it's been a thing that I've seen a number of times where you go into a prospect meeting and they just flip to that back page and they go, that price is a little bit higher than I want to pay, so I'm just going to not listen, right? That's a thing that I've seen happen plenty of times. So this is one of those areas where you want to have this modular documents for a number of reasons, right? It helps you scale your relationship with your client. It allows you to standardize things on a much easier basis, but also it makes it easier for the client to digest what they're signing and agreeing to, right? When you have this big monolithic thing that's 30 or 40 pages that describes all of the stuff that you do for them, it is a recipe, having them bring their lawyer in to review it and kind of pick it apart, right? That's not a thing you want either. So when you make these things more modular and make it a little bit easier to read, you're a little bit less likely to end up with a lawyer on the back end reviewing it for the client. Because if you use plain language and not make it to be this big mysterious thing, it's a good thing for you as well. The second question, or questions really, because there's 2 of them, are, when do I update my MSA and how do I do that, right? Those are 2 real common and related questions. The first part of the question of when do you update it is pretty straightforward, because your MSA is a document that should sort of live for a few years on its own. It shouldn't require a lot of maintenance, shouldn't require a lot of updating. So typically, every 3 to 5 years is about when you update your MSA. When it comes to the question of how do I make the change, there's a couple things that I think are worth leaning into. The first one is I think it's a smart idea to lean into whatever the method of your original MSA was, right? So if they signed a paper MSA or like an e-signature thing, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world just to kind of go that route. If you did your online MSA to begin with, then I would just update that way. And I'll talk a little bit more about the online stuff here in a few minutes. But either way, I think it's worth making those changes at the normal course of like interaction with the client, right? If they have a renewal coming up, I would just kind of have there be a conversation piece there. If your insurance agent or your lawyer says, hey, I think there's some changes, I think you should make it to your MSA, you could potentially use that as a conversation topic as well. There's a couple different times where that would make more sense. But it really makes the most sense to probably do it when you're doing other things with the client, right? An SBR, a normal agreement update, a renewal type of thing. Those times work really, really well. And really what's going to happen is you're going to change your MSA, and like 85 or 90% of your clients are going to go, yep, no problem. Another 10% are going to probably be a little bit slow to respond and slow to deal with it. And then there's a few clients that would potentially complain about it or want to make some changes or whatever else. And it's up to you as to whether or not you want to allow those changes to happen. But for the most part, those don't happen that frequently. Usually your clients are like, yep, good to go, moving on, especially if you are transparent with the changes, right? I recently had a service I use all the time change their terms and conditions, which is basically the same thing as an MSA. And they said, here's what we changed. And they enumerated the changes, 3 or 4 bullet points. It was very clearly written. I was able to understand it. I didn't have to go digging into it. And I was like, cool, I'm happy with that. It was pretty easy to deal with. If you can do something with your clients and just say, I had to make some changes. My lawyer or my insurance company said that I should do it this way, or we need to make some changes for whatever reason. Here's what the changes are. It's going to be very much more obvious to the client that they should probably just sign it, right? The more of a mystery you make it, the more likely they are to bring in their own legal counsel. And when you bring in their own legal counsel, they're much more likely to pick it apart, ask questions, and those kinds of things. So be as transparent about this as you possibly can. One thing that I do not recommend is to just change it and hope the client never sees it, or kind of change it on the back end and like never really mention it. I mean, yeah, you could do it that way, especially if you do the online side of the world and you have your MSA online and they agree to it by, accepting a contract or accepting a proposal or whatever. Yeah, you could do it that way. I'm not a huge fan of it to just kind of sneak it in that way. I'd much rather have the conversation about it because, again, this isn't the first time you're going to hear me say this, and probably the last either, is that I think you should be using your contracts as a place to be on the same page with your clients as much as possible. So I think you should use your update to your MSA to be on the same page again with your clients, even if the changes are minor. If you're getting some value out of this video, please do me a favor, hit that like button down below. It really does help me with the YouTube algorithm and all those things. So the next question, and this one's probably the most frequently asked question when we talk about legal stuff, is what do I do when a client declines a service, right? How do I handle that? Do I make them sign a thing? How does this work? Well, there's a couple different ways of handling it, but my preferred way is something that Brad Gross talks about in a number of his different podcasts, and I'll link also the links to some of those podcasts down below. But the short version of this is you send them an email basically doing 3 things. Thing 1, you tell them what they're declining, right? You're declining MFA for whatever reason. MFA is the best way to prevent unauthorized people from logging into your account, right? Like you just kind of describe the service, right? That's thing 1. You describe the service. Thing 2 is tell them what the risks are for them to decline the service, right? You're at much higher risk of having your account compromised, which might lead to theft of data, ransomware. Though, like enumerate what the dangers are to the client for declining the service. And then 3, probably the most important one of the 3, is we're not going to do this for you in the future until you tell us in writing, right? You want to make that as clear as possible. You declined it. We're confirming this in writing. We won't do it for you until you tell us in writing that you're going to do it, that you want us to do it for you. And there's probably going to be a charge, by the way. And make sure that they understand that we're not doing this for you now, right? That's the whole point. Now, I would not just send an email to them and say, hey, reply to this email acknowledging that this has been, that you agree to this, because all it takes is for them is to not reply and then you forget to follow up on it. I'm actually a much bigger fan of just sending it to them and letting that live. Now, If you really, really wanted them to sign off on it, yeah, I suppose, but then it becomes incumbent on you as the MSP business owner to track them down and make sure that they sign it and make sure that they agree to it, and you like memorialize that and like have it someplace and like hold on to it forever and ever and ever, right? That's the thing that becomes incumbent on you. So I think you really probably just want to enumerate the service, enumerate the risk, and to let them know we're not touching this until you tell us to touch it in writing. Like I think that is a very solid way of handling that situation. And it happens pretty frequently. In fact, the question came up the week before I was writing this for probably the 5th time already this year, right? So this is the thing that happens all the time. The 4th types of questions I get when people are talking about their contracts is, how do I get my contracts in alignment? How do I deploy them with my clients, right? Those are really common questions. And my first answer is pretty much always, you should talk to your lawyer to have them help you with this. Now, this contract stuff, I suppose you can do it DIY style, and frankly, some MSPs can probably get by with it, but the reality is that as much as you could, and as much as you're probably smart enough to kind of figure it out, this is much better handled by an attorney. Now, all that said, here are a couple ways of handling it if I was in your shoes on a DIY side of the world. Method 1 is you're going to get a wet signature or an e-signature on the contracts, right? It's the most straightforward and the easiest. Basically, you have your MSA, you have all your different services agreements, you have your proposals on all of those things prepared as either individual, as basically individual documents or like an envelope or whatever your e-signature term uses. But basically, you have your client sign each of those different documents, have them, and then you countersign or counter e-sign or whatever. And like if you do that all the way across the board, you're in a pretty good spot because you both agreed to it. There's no ambiguity there at all, right? That's the straightforward piece. If I'm doing this DIY style, I'm just probably going to go that route and just make sure I have my rear end covered should something bad happen. The second method really is to have an online MSA and then send quotes or proposals over via email or whatever. And by approving the quote or approving the proposal or whatever, you're agreeing to this other MSA. Like that's a way you could do it. If you're going to DIY this, there's a couple caveats. Caveat number 1, you got to make sure that you have that URL needs to be online and available all the time, right? It can't be a thing where, oops, my website's been malfunctioning for a while and my MSA document got deleted. Like that's going to be a problem for you should you ever get sued. The second caveat is that you need to make sure that you are extremely consistent with referring back to that MSA and basically say, by approving this, you're agreeing to that, right? You need to make sure that's on every service contract, on every quote, everything that ties your service to the client, that needs to be there, right? That's a really important piece. Should you ever want or need to change your MSA on your website, you then need to turn on some versioning, right? So basically what you'll do is your MSA page now becomes the MSA landing page, where basically if you sign a contract from date X to date Y, this is your MSA over here. And if you send your contract from day Y to day Z or day Y forward, your MSA is over here. And that way you're allowed to have multiple versions on your website. So that way that when the client signs a new contract with you or whatever, they sign the new one and they get the new MSA. That becomes that part of it. I still think you want to let them know that you made some changes to your MSA and what that looks like. Again, you're trying to be on the same page with your clients, and trying to sneak one through by changing your online MSA is a good way to end up having a frustrated client in the future, especially if there's any kind of ambiguity around, I didn't know I was signing something new or I was agreeing to something new, right? If you properly execute this online thing, an online version of your MSAs, it's almost certainly legally fine, right? Like if you get sued and you do it the right way, you're probably going to be just fine. But if you do it at all the wrong way, or there's any kind of ambiguity in there, this is a situation where you may find yourself in the untenable situation of having a lawsuit happen where your lawyer has to basically argue with the method of kind of doing these doing your MSAs and deploying them and updating them at their normal hourly rate with opposing counsel. Let me tell you that most lawyers' hourly rate is 2 or 3 times your hourly rate. So take as much mystery out of this process as you possibly can and save yourself lots and lots of legal fees down the road. Doing all of this legal stuff the right way and having good client contracts is vital to your organization. Again, I don't think you should do this on a DIY basis. I know there's plenty of templates and contracts out there that you can grab online and you think you can do it yourself. But honestly, A few grand to do this right from the get-go is going to save you far more than that on the back end, along with the fact that you'll be able to sleep better at night knowing that you are properly legally protected should something bad happen. If you're looking for more legal videos, I'm going to drop a link up here that covers some MSA best practices. And over here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the three different types of contracts you're going to have within your business, right? Your employment contracts, your client contracts, and if you have a business partner, your business partner contracts. Thanks for coming on this ramble with me, and I hope to see you on the next one.